Ms. Stetzer, I want to welcome you to join a conversation. We hope to be a profitable and God-honoring conversation. We know that thousands of you are actually watching online, and we have a group here in the room as well. And I should say that the room we're broadcasting from is at the National Civil Rights Museum, the Lorraine Motel. And if you're maybe 50, 60 years of age, you would remember what happened on April 4th, 1968. This is where Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And many people here in the studio will kind of roam around the grounds and visit here. But it's obviously a key moment in our history, and it's an opportunity to have a key conversation at this key moment in history. I want to encourage you to tweet and follow the Kainos movement. It's KAINOS_movement, and you can use the hashtag a time to speak. A time to speak is the hashtag as we engage in this conversation. Brian, you brought us together here. And I want you to tell us. Why. Why did you bring us together, and what do you hope to accomplish through our conversation today?
Yeah, like everybody else, Ed. A couple of days ago, when I woke up and saw the news that they had refused to indict Eric Garner, my heart sank at the grand jury's decision. But I think I got even a little bit more sad as I kind of watched the same cast of characters assemble together to kind of be on the scene and make pleas for justice. And in the middle of it all, I just kind of wondered aloud, where are the conservative evangelical voices? That's a good question. As Ed mentioned, we are right here at the National Civil Rights Museum, which of course is the old Lorraine Motel where Dr. King was assassinated. If there's one thing that frustrates the Memphian, it's just the reality that we feel like the world has taken a picture of our town and dated it April 4th, 1968, and won't let us move past it. But for good reason. One of the great anomalies of the city of Memphis, like most southern cities during the civil rights movement, was your biggest advocates for justice, especially among those who are marginalized African Americans, were Christians, and your greatest opponents to it, whether through indifference and passivity or aggressively, were at the same time people who were self-proclaimed followers of Jesus Christ. Earlier this year, John Piper and I sat here, and I had the privilege of interviewing him. And I asked him a question: where were you on April 4th, 1968? And he shared with us he was at a very well-known evangelical school where he was finishing up his studies. And I said, well, what did you guys do that day? Did you stop and have prayer? Did you talk? And he says, we did absolutely nothing. And I just sat there a couple of days ago, again, watching the news in the aftermath of Eric Garner and going, my parents' generation was silent. I'm not saying my parents specifically, but the conservative evangelicals were silent. We cannot, in this generation, be silent again. We cannot go on just preaching our homiletical masterpieces in the face of such injustice. It's indeed time to speak, and we need some prophets who will stand up. Let me just say this final thing. I'm indebted to the civil rights movement, Dr. Ralph David Abernathy, Martin Luther King Jr., Andrew Young. Because of them, I can sit on any seat, on any bus that I'd like, drink out of any water fountain. I'm indebted to them. But while the civil rights movement changed laws, it couldn't change hearts. And that's where God, working through His people in the already not yet kingdom of God called the church, that's where we can offer some hope. So my hope tonight is that we would point the way forward and not so much dwell on the forensics of the case, but speak to the injustice, but offer the world the true hope, which comes through the gospel of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.
It's a good and important word that evangelicals, particularly Southern evangelicals, were, they were on the wrong side of the hoses at Birmingham, and consistently have been rebuked, and I think rightly so for that. And so the question is, how do we as evangelical believers, which we all represent here, engage in this conversation in a fruitful and a faithful way? There are some challenges, obviously, about even the disagreements that we have and the way people perceive issues of race. We should say that even here, we recognize people could say, well, there's one human race, or there's two, there's the sons of Adam,
right.
And we know, but we're going to use the term in the more common usage today. And let me share just a couple of numbers as we get started, and we'll put this on your screen. Look at the views of race and racism in America. We recently surveyed 1,000 random Americans at Lifeway Research, and we kind of looked at two questions. We asked the question to agree or disagree. People can see this on their screen as they're watching at home. I'll explain to those of you in the room. We have come so far on racial relations, and 74% of Americans actually agreed with that statement. 23% disagreed that we have come so far. But what's interesting is the flip side almost of that question is we've got so far to go on racial relations, actually polled at a higher number. 81% said we've got so far to go on racial relations. But what I found interesting was, and I think you will as well, is that when you compare and you break out the question by African American respondents compared to white and Hispanic or Latino, what you find is that those who strongly agree we've got so far to go on racial relations, actually a statistically significant difference. African Americans feel a greater sense, it appears, of urgency. How do we engage on these issues? We've got so far still to go. And when we ask, we've come so far, African Americans, statistically significant difference, strongly disagree at a higher level. And so there's obviously some challenges, the way people perceive things. DBD, I want to start with you. And first, before we get to into your question, I asked the question, but I want you to tell in your answer the shirt you're wearing and why. But let's talk a little bit about the current state of race relations in the United States. We recognize this is a conversation that may be unique to a culture and a context. You've spoken up boldly, prophetically, not without significant pushback. Tell me about the shirt and why are you speaking up so boldly and forcefully on these issues?
Are you going to give an account for what you're wearing, brother?
Yeah, I am.
Mostly the beard, brother.
Yeah,
Mostly the beard.
This is a midlife crisis, so I'm willing to embrace that. Why? Tell us a little bit why.
The shirt's a gift from my wife.
Yeah.
She knows my heart for these issues. It's simply a listing of first names: Emmett Till, Trayvon Martin, Sean Bell, a number of folks. And the saddest part of the shirt you probably can't see because I'm overweight. Is
Not
at the
judgment
bottom.
over here. No judgment over here.
Is at the bottom, etc. We need to remember these persons whose lives have been taken, and remember that they are persons, and remember that they have families. Remember that they're made in God's image. Remember that whenever a life is cut short, so too is the potential to be transformed and renewed and conformed to the image of God. And so that's the shirt.
Yeah.
That's the shirt. Your question about...
Tell us about why you think these issues matter in the time and the space that we're in today in our country and our context.
Well, they matter because they're still life and death issues, aren't they? These are not small issues. These are not minor issues. These are not light, superficial issues. These are things that have gravity. These are things that affect people, affect families and whole communities. However you frame out the problem, which we will talk about here, what can't be denied is the colossal, almost oppressive bearing down of weight on people. And that expresses itself in what someone thought was a harmless conversation in the break room that turned out to be an explosion between two people along the lines of race or racial understanding. And that expresses itself in public policy. There's a long history of public policy addressing and impacting these kinds of issues. So these things matter, and they matter for all of us. And one of the things we have to understand is that the conversations we have about race isn't sort of, I think sometimes when people hear even the word race, what comes to mind is black people, as if white people aren't in a, to use the language, a racial group,
sure.
Right? And I think the language is problematic for the reasons you stated in the introduction. But as if white people don't embody some kind of racial class and standing. And so these stories are American stories. What happened to Tamir Rice and John Crawford, what happened to Eric Garner and Mike Brown, what happened to these persons isn't simply the story of those individuals or their families or their communities. It's our collective story. If we don't sort of roll up our sleeves and grapple with these life and death issues in a way that faces them honestly, with the resources and the hope of the gospel, then there's not much hope for us.
And Tabidi, wouldn't you say those stories frame how we see other stories?
Absolutely.
Well, let's talk about some of that framing, because Tabidi, you specifically and articulately have addressed and really aggressively addressed the grand jury testimony. You've spoken about the concerns about the process and about the injustice. Where, Brian, you of course been writing at the Gospel Coalition site, which is one of our co-sponsors, along with the Kainos Movement and with Lifeways Ministry Grid. You wrote, and I think the first thing you wrote was at my site at Christianity Today, and you didn't. Your whole issue, I think we titled it, but was you should care about Ferguson despite the facts.
Right.
There are issues that are bigger than this, and Voddie, you took a very different approach, and we kind of joked beforehand that would be a minority approach, sort of on this panel and this conversation.
Yeah,
but
I think that's an overstatement.
I think that's an overstatement. That's true.
I'm that dude.
You're that guy.
I'm all by myself.
All right. But I think it's important to note there's not an African American view. Yeah. Like there's not an Anglo view or a Latino view or everywhere else it may be. So let's talk a little bit. Voddie, to you, how do you frame this issue? Your article, was I believe it crashed the Gospel Coalition site. It was read so widely. You ended up on Fox News, which even that phrase has cultural connotations and challenges all around it.
Yeah. Right. They weren't the only ones you invited.
They were not the only ones. Exactly. There was actually some. Thabiti responded, but also there were stronger responses from a group of 4 African American leaders, Ephraim Smith and Christina Cleveland, I happen to know, and 2 others I don't know. But they called your article "black on black violence."
Oh yeah.
So talk to me about.
And there are people who have called for the editor at the Gospel Coalition to be fired.
Yes.
For publishing my article.
So what was the point of your article? And based on the reaction, any thoughts on the reaction thus far?
Yeah, many thoughts. But let me just put this in context. Let me put my response in context. I grew up in South Central Los Angeles during the 70s and 80s, in the heyday of crack wars, Uzis, drive-bys, so on and so forth. And there were these 2 ideas that were held in tension for us, especially for young black men in that community. On the one idea, there was this hatred toward and distrust of law enforcement, just undoubtedly. The LAPD was understood to be the biggest gang in LA, all right? But on the other hand, there was this sense when something would happen, when a young black man, especially one of, gangbangers or something like that, when something would happen to one of them, there would be older black people in the community, unfortunately, usually women, who would sit us down and say, that's why you don't live like that. That's what saved me. Is those people who sat me down and said, regardless of what we believe about all this other stuff going on, that's why you don't live like that. That was the check that I had. That is a significant part of our cultural tradition. That check that says we don't live like that. And so for me, one of the points that I was trying to make, and which is why I brought it around to my 7 sons, is that for me, when I look at this, regardless of all of the other issues surrounding it and facts that are being disputed and debated and whatnot, for me, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is the fact that Eric Garner, Mike Brown, they were not Martin Luther King Jr. They were not. There is a difference. There is a distinction between individuals who are living lives that represent what we are fighting for and individuals who are living lives that represent what we are trying to rise above. And so for me, that was the note that was important to be hit that I felt like wasn't being hit.
Right. It wasn't just that. You also said, though, it taught me an unfortunate lesson. The greatest threat to me was other black men.
Yes.
And you spoke on issue of black-on-black crime. You quoted some statistics that later people would critique and say people tend to kill their neighbors who tend to live in white neighborhoods and predominantly black neighborhoods. But
but nowhere near at the rate.
But we'd say there's disproportionate
absolutely.
as well. So
not even the same kinds of crimes.
So I don't think a lot of people would disagree with what you said a minute ago. But some other things you said in the article were basically Michael Brown maybe got what he deserved as too strong of a language.
I said he reaped what he sowed.
Reaped what he sowed.
And I mentioned there was a theme in my article of violence. I talked about fatherlessness and violence and so on and so forth. Then I talked about a violent attack in a store and a life that ended in violence.
Yeah.
I thought it was kind of a little bit cheap for people to say, oh, so you steal some cigarettes, you deserve to get killed. That's being completely and utterly dishonest with what I wrote. It's obvious I'm talking about the violence.
Yeah, well, let me say, Thabiti in his response said, and I don't know specifically in response, it was in an article you responded to some of the responses to Ferguson, quoting you said, Mike Brown doesn't deserve death because his father sinned against his mother. And if we regard him as fatherless, then we shouldn't be sneering and condemning, but actually more eager to see that justice for Brown is done. Talk to us a little bit about your response to the situation, and really your response to Voddie's comments and his article as well.
Yeah, if I press through the tone of my brother's piece, there's a lot there that I would agree with. So I've spent most of my professional life as a social scientist working on family well-being issues. One of the things that's rare in the social sciences is that you ever get a research consensus. You just never get that. And the fact that you have that among liberals and conservatives and so on and so forth with regard to family structure and the positive outcomes for children raised by their biological parents, intact marriages, the fact that you get a premium for that those children do better, and everybody agrees on that in the research, that's colossal. That's in social science world, that's miraculous. So there's much that Voddie was pointing at that I go, okay, yeah, I see that. If I press through tones and so on, I see that. What I think Voddie's piece missed was the kind of framing he just gave it, because the kind of messages he got from the older women in his community were the messages I got from the older women in my community. So I got a whooping on the way home from school by my neighbor, and then she told my mom I got another whooping when I got home, because we weren't going to live like that. Yeah. That was missing in the piece. Instead, what we got was something that seemed to suggest quite the opposite, that endemic to African-American culture was this sort of criminal behavior, this kind of criminal culture and the glorifying of thug life. Now, you get that with Tupac, you get that with Biggie, you get that in hip-hop in some circles, but I think your post came dangerously close to characterizing the community that way, and I think that's an overstatement.
But
let me say just one other thing. And then I think the piece that troubled me most was, I'm cheering all the way in the beginning of the post, yes, I'm a pastor, why does my opinion matter? But I got one, I'm gonna give it. I care most about my local church and local context. I'm just amening that all the way. And then you say, I'm gonna give a gospel perspective. And honestly, brother, if I'm being honest, I don't think it's a cheap shot at all to say, when you then land with, he reaped what he sowed, you landed on the law, not the gospel. Mm. You landed on just deserts, not the grace of God in Jesus Christ, because as sinners, we're all treated better than we deserve, than our sins deserve. And so that was the piece that was most troubling for me, with a brother I love and labor with, and could understand where you were coming from in many perspectives. And so I think we need to sort of, if we're going to have this conversation, we need to, A, know which conversation we're having. Yeah. Are we having the police brutality conversation? That's one conversation. Or are we having the conversation about the community and difficulties and problems in the community? That's a different conversation. And what I keep seeing is the kind of pushback that inserts the community issues in the police brutality conversation as a way of denying the police brutality issues. And I'm saying, no, that's just completely illegitimate. Those are both important conversations to have. They both help us fill in the whole picture. And we need to fill in the whole picture if we're going to have an honest conversation and work on multiple fronts. But we can't use those things as ways of denying the other. So I can't talk about the injustice of the system as a way of denying the sort of family issues and moral responsibility issues. And we can't talk about the moral responsibility issues in a way to deny the system issues. And if we're going to bring the gospel to this, we've got to have in mind that our God treats us better than we deserve. And he has sent his son precisely because we're criminals and thieves and robbers. That's all that ever come before him, right? And it's those who say.
You're not a subtle man. And
yeah, but let me also say there's a difference between gospel content and gospel conclusion.
I want you to share two things. Respond to the media, but in hindsight, and it's okay, I mean, again, you're not a wilted flower man, you can just tell me no. In hindsight, would you have done anything different in the article? But first respond to the media and then talk to me about hindsight.
Yeah, in hindsight, would I have done anything different in the article? Of course I would have done. Yeah, there's nothing I've ever written that I would do differently. But let me.
For something more than.
Yeah. But let me respond to Thabiti's point. There's a difference between lack of gospel content, lack of gospel conclusion. Where we talk about the gospel, is not mandated. The conclusion there was for effect. The conclusion there was not to say that this is the message of the gospel, because there is no understanding of the message of the gospel without the law. And so, yeah, that was absolutely.
But the law's only the beginning.
You get no disagreement from me in that perspective. But my other point that I want to make here is that what I'm talking about is how we take these issues and how we lionize certain individuals who are not individuals to be lionized. How we take certain individuals and put their names on T-shirts, you know what I mean, to the exclusion of other individuals. Because there are other people who did not live those kinds of lives, who have also lost their lives. They're police officers. Death of police officers is up 65%. Where are their names on T-shirts? And I think when we shape things in this way, that's what keeps the division among us and between us. The other thing is, you said that there were these two ideas that we had to keep in context. You can't talk about these personal responsibility issues without talking about systemic issues. I reject that. I reject that completely. Well, you can absolutely do that.
Just to be clear, yeah. I didn't say that conceptually you can't do that. I said if you want a full picture, you have to talk about both. You don't have to talk about them at the same time even, but you have to put both of those things on the table.
I reject that as well. I reject that as well.
Why would you reject that?
Here's why I reject that. Because we're assuming.
Okay.
You see, we look at what happened to Mike Brown, and we assume that there was injustice there. That's an assumption, and that's part of the problem. Part of the problem is we sit around and we say, oh yeah, black folks, we know something like that happened. We know what happened. That's what I refer to as ethnic Gnosticism. Like we know why, because we black, and black folk know what happened. Nobody has to tell me. I don't need a grand jury. I know what happened. No, we don't know what happened. We can't assume that there was injustice there.
For the good of my own soul, can I hear you riff? Is there, in your worldview, because when I read your piece, the tone of it lacked empathy. It came across as if he got what he deserved.
Police officers didn't see it that way.
Right.
So it didn't lack empathy. It just lacked the kind of empathy that you might have been looking for.
Yeah,
but hold on one second. This is very important. In your worldview, is there any place for systemic injustice? Do you see that at all, structural injustice? Or is it all personal? If they'd have made better choices.
I think the question needs to be more specific than that. Because there is no system that is inherently just. That's obvious. But do I believe that the system is inherently rigged against black people? No, I don't.
Interesting.
No, I don't. And I don't make that assumption when I see things happen.
I want to get you to respond, but I want to make sure that never has Matt Chandler sat so long on a panel without speaking. So true. That's actually true. It's really statistically true. Kind of nice to see. Everything I say is statistically true for the record. That's not true. Except 87% of the time. Brian, what you did, you didn't go the same direction in the conversation that the BD did. You didn't go the same direction that Bodie did, obviously. You went to that there are real systemic injustice issues, and you're kind of called out. Where are the white evangelical sisters and brothers speaking in solidarity with the brokenness of the system? I want to explain that. I want to come back to you. I know I want to respond to Bodie, and I'm good with that. But explain why that's the direction you went in the conversation, and why not to, if I might say, personal responsibility or police brutality or systematic injustice within the grand jury system. Why there?
So I look at the aftershocks of events like this, and I go, man, watching the news for a couple of nights, if I had a black and white TV, I'd assumed we were in Watts 1968. And I'm just going, we have not come as far as we think we have. There's still this polarization between African American and white groups. In fact, several people on Twitter go, I don't see Asians on this panel or Hispanics. And I wanted to deal with the two most polarized groups. And at the end of the day,
that's the case.
Absolutely.
The polarization's there.
At the end of the day, I'm going, we don't know each other. And we don't know each other's stories. And if you don't have proximity, you will lack empathy. And so you've got to be able to sit down, have a cup of coffee, and get into the narratives of other people. And I think if you do that, then you will see things from a different perspective that won't cause you to compromise your core beliefs. But you go, I get that. Now, the other extreme, what I try to articulate in the article, is all of us have a cultural hermeneutic, But I think my phrasing was my Jesusness must always trump my blackness. So I'm not talking here about this deification of culture. It's got to be subjugated to who Christ is. And that because of that, I think the first thing we've got to do when this stuff happens, instead of going to facts, level 2 communication, we need to get inside the skin of another and feel. This is what I think Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians 9 when he says, I have become all things to all people. It's the ability to empathize and get into their narrative.
The article you wrote, people can find at the Christianity Today website. If they just Google your name there, the articles that we're referring to are at the Gospel Coalition website. Did you also write something at the Gospel Coalition as well, or no? Was it just linked there? I don't remember.
I don't think
so.
But,
okay, so there's where you find those articles. Thabiti, if you want to respond, we'll give you a second to respond, then I want to broaden the conversation, bring Matt and Darren in.
Just a quick section.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Couple just bullet points. Number one, to remember a person isn't necessary to lionize a person. No one here is claiming that anyone, Eric Garner or Mike Brown, were Boy Scouts. I feel very much like I'm Mike Brown at 18. All the things that developed in the media profile about Mike Brown and the sort of thug narrative that developed, I'm going, I can check all those boxes. And yet, I dare say that most people who know me now, given Christ's grace in my life, would say, you don't look like that guy at all. What I want for the Mike Browns is that opportunity to survive their teenage years and someone to say, you don't look like that kid at all. Amen. So that's not lionizing them. That's not equating them with Dr. King, who, by the way, wasn't Dr. King.
Right.
He had his issues, too.
Yes.
Right? It's not to be romantic about anybody. And so I just need to be clear about that. Secondly, I think it's deeply problematic to say that there is no systemic injustice along the lines of ethnicity and race in this country. The entire country has been predicated upon.
I don't know that he said there's no system. Did you say there's no system?
He says he rejects the category altogether.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
No. Okay, you just say there's
absolutely.
no
I reject the category altogether.
Yeah.
He's not a subtle man.
No.
You said that.
That's why we have a bi-ethnic man in the White House. Okay. That's why we have a black man as the chief legal officer in the United States.
So everything's all good
That's
now.
why
It's
we
all
have.
good
Come on now. Come on now. Can we at least be honest enough with one another to not go to elementary school and say that if you have something positive to say, you think there's nothing bad? Because I've already said that our system is not perfect. Right? I've already said that.
But you're saying imperfection.
What I'm saying is, it's not.
So
what I'm saying is, it's actually the opposite.
Let's go back to
we've got people bending over backwards on behalf of black people in this country. We've got people afraid of being called racist. Listen, in evangelical circles right now, we've got people who are saying on homosexuality, we need to sit down and talk together. On racism, no quarter. Huh?
People are saying
what
that
happened?
They shouldn't have conversations around
on race. No, a racist is not to be abided. There is no mercy. There is no. Again, we have to listen to everybody except Officer Wilson, because we don't need to get in his skin. We don't need to have coffee with him.
Okay, Thabiti,
we don't need to have.
Finish your statement. I want to bring in Matt Chandler.
Yeah, and we don't want to. We don't want this to be a grand jury on voting off, right? Yeah, because we know he's going to get off, even though he's wrong.
Yeah, exactly.
So just to finish.
That may be the tweet of the day. Right there.
Just to finish the thought.
Yeah,
here.
please.
I think it's ahistorical, and I think it's very close to willfully ignorant to argue that there are no systemic injustices in this country, either in its history or in its present.
Never argue that.
And to argue, great, so we're agreeing. So to argue that those things don't exist now, or to argue that because we have some high-profile exemplars, like the president, attorney general, so on and so forth, that those are things of the past. I think we rob ourselves of the sanctifying work of the gospel when the Spirit confronts us about this sin. Racism is just a species of alienation from the fall. It's a particular kind of alienation that operates systematically along the lines of ethnicity, skin color, and so on. If we don't face that and aren't honest about our own hearts, and honest about how those hearts get expressed in systems. Systems are run by people, all of whom are fallen, all of whom have the same proclivities that we have toward prejudice and bias and so on. If we're not honest about that, we're really robbing ourselves of the opportunity for the Spirit to move us along in really sanctifying ways.
But if all of those people,
a minute. Go.
but if all of those people are biased, we have to acknowledge that all of those people and all of their ethnicities are biased.
Well, I think all people in all ethnicities have biases.
Exactly.
But
exactly. So everybody in the system, we're saying, is biased, because I think we're crossing categories here between personal racism, which no one would deny, and the idea that we have.
Well, let's go to the idea that we have systemic issues, and there's blatant racism or direct racism, often called indirect racism. Something that's often tied to what's called indirect racism is the concept of white privilege. And Matt Chandler, you were sort of, pastor in there in Dallas, minding your own business, writing books, changing the world for Jesus, and you wade into the issue not in a small way, but you wade into the issue by a discussion of white privilege. You said, what is so deceptive about white privilege is that it is different from blatant racism or bias. A privileged person's heart may be free from racist thoughts or biased attitudes, but may still fail to see how the very privilege afforded to him or her shapes how he or she interprets and understands the situations and circumstances of people without privilege. It kind of blew up, but it's an important conversation to have. I should say, Vody in his article specifically referred to white privilege as a Marxist idea.
Gramscian.
What's that?
Gramscian.
Yes, there you go. To my knowledge, you're not a Marxist, though you could be secretly one.
We'll find out here in a second.
We'll find out in a second. Let's see where it goes. So what are you describing in white privilege?
Well, here was really to give kind of the background and the turmoil of my own heart that led to the blog post is I knew I was wading into waters that I don't tend to wade into. What I meant by that is I knew it was going to be a long day when I posted.
You didn't know it was going to be a long month.
Because, and could keep going after this.
We're working on it.
I knew that any of the tiny percentage of Anglos who are either working poor or below the poverty line were going to feel completely ostracized and like, give me a break, there's no such thing. I knew that the small percentage of African Americans who had pushed out of poverty into either working class, upper middle class, were going to say there was no such thing. But my primary concern in a church that is upper middle class Anglo was to help them understand why they were not understanding what was going on in all these instances. And I don't think, if it's Marxist to say that looking across the narrative of the Bible, God seems to be pretty dialed into the human heart in that the privileged class is going to have a tendency to suppress and oppress to protect their privilege and perks, which is why there are such stern warnings to the wealthy. It's why even he comes to the people of God in Leviticus and says that your justice, your law, must be the same for the foreigner as it is for you. And throughout the narrative, there's a strong push on the wealthy and the privileged to understand that the widow, the orphan, the poor, the disenfranchised, the margins will not enjoy these privileges, so that you must be aware of these privileges and use these privileges to help, to strengthen, and to understand. And that was what I was trying to help our predominantly Anglo church understand, because I'm reading what they're posting on their Facebook page. I'm seeing what they're tweeting. And honestly, I was really aggravated that morning. I normally am cooler than that and don't enter when I'm aggravated. But I just read two things and I was like, and dove in. And so, and then, by the grace of God, when I became the president of Acts 29, I sat down with all of our African American guys and just said, talk to me. And that began. I'd already had friends in the network who were African American, but when I began to see how easy it was for my Anglos, all of them, versus how difficult it was in regards to fundraising, in regards to trust, in regards to that I just went, man, it is way easier for a white guy to plant a church, regardless of where he's planting, than it is for an African American, Latino, or Asian to do the same thing. It's harder for him to get money, harder for him to get support, harder for him to get audience, I was finding that we had Anglo churches with like a couple of sound systems in storage and some of our African American Latino churches trying to scrap together pennies to just get something to project in the room that they were meeting in. And so that's why I don't think I'm Marxist, because I passionately believe what Paul wrote to Timothy, that if you don't work and provide for your household, you're worse than an unbeliever. But at the same time, to not say that the privileged class is responsible to understand and responsible to help, surely we're not talking about Marxism at that point.
Okay. Brian, one of the things that the reason I kind of invited you, and you mentioned Acts 29 leaders, Leonce Crump, and I had a series of leaders sort of right at the issue of Christianity today. I did a series called It's Time to Listen, which I think maybe as a contrast, it's time to speak. I think both, for me, I was trying to say to white evangelicals, why don't you listen to African American evangelicals? So I had like nine guest posts from bishops of the International Pentecostal Holiness Church, to you and others. And but part of the reason was I was struck. I come from a law enforcement family. My uncles are New York City cops. My brother's a DA in Charlotte, right? But I was struck by godly African-American leaders, so many of whom had a different reaction than really even godly Anglo and other leaders as well. And it was, I mean, there were some outliers, and we've joked, and of course, you would be one of the outliers, Vody, and but that distinction was back to the issue of injustice. And when Matt weighed in on that, you and others responded to that, weighing in on that. Why is it so important that people like Matt and Anglo evangelicals and other, maybe Latino and Asian and others, speak up on these issues right now for you and for other African American evangelicals?
It's the Bible. I mean, there's over 2,350 verses that talks about God's heart for the orphan, the alien, the widow, the least of these. I mean, in Matthew 25:31-46, Jesus literally puts himself in the shoes of the homeless person, of the sick person, of the person who's in jail. He says, you didn't visit me. And so I think fundamentally what we're looking for when these things happen is advocacy. Now, I do believe that sometimes our perspective will get skewed among some of us, where we don't even want to respond to whether or not something is true. And that part of what my brother shared, I wholeheartedly agree to. But what I'm saying is, let's not jump there at first. Let's just stop and at least try to understand why when I turn on the television and see an Eric Garner going, I can't breathe, how I will have automatically some suspicion because of the very names on my brother's T-shirt. I mean, here's Emmett Till. I mean, my father was part of the great migration. My grandparents migrated up from North Carolina to New Jersey. In the mid-1950s, Emmett Till is killed for whistling at a white woman. Allegedly. So now my father, when he goes to visit his grandparents, he's about 5 or 6 years of age. You know how when you start reading at that age, you read everything? My dad remembers one of the first things he ever read, age 5 or 6, what whites only. So that's a part of the narrative that makes you flinch when you see cases like Eric Garner. And I'm going, instead of throwing the flag, my white brothers and sisters, or going silent, would you at least speak up for us? Would you at least sit down and try to understand? And that's what I was trying to get at.
I want you to know that probably the reason I turned that into a series was because of what you said in that article. And hopefully we were able to, in some way, advance the conversation in my little kind of corner of the blogosphere. Darren, you have a church, you pastor a church, multiple campuses, close to Ferguson, Missouri. You did a video dialogue, which you released. Tell me a little bit more about what have you done to address some of these issues, particularly the Mike Brown situation from your pulpit. One of the things Carl Ellis was a very well-known scholar in the African-American community at Redeemer in Westminster. Carl said that whenever there's some situation like this, almost every African-American church is going to address it in church, and hardly any Anglo church is going to address it in church. What did you do and why at your church?
I taught from John 4, and where Jesus encountered the Samaritan woman. And, he was very truthful with her, but he entered her heart through a wound. Go call your husband. And I just had this sense that Jesus addressing the other, the Samaritan woman, the half-breeds, and I just talked to our majority culture people, and I just said, here's our example. Let's go there. Let's have these hard conversations. Let's not miss our time. I really believe this is the church's time. The whole world is watching us. And we have great opportunity to go in and have these conversations. And that's why we did the Race Roundtable. We just said, hey, our church is very diverse politically, socioeconomically, and increasingly racially. And we just said, let's bring people who disagree, and let's have conversation, and let's listen to each other, and let's model maybe for our own church and then maybe other churches. What does it look like to go there and to go into hard places, to go into woundedness, and to ask questions and to learn and to listen? And that's what we're trying to do. And it's been very fruitful. My brothers and sisters who are black, we're already talking about race, they say. Thanks for coming into our conversation. And so I feel like we're being invited in by our brothers and sisters, and we need to take that opportunity.
How have people in your church responded? Both, if you could, black and white and other, how have people in your church responded? Has it been all positive? Has it been a mix? No. Talk a little bit.
Oh, it's just every side of you've got the Fox News loving right that feels like we're not standing up for police officers, and then you've got the other side, we're not doing enough. And the recent roundtable, we brought a police officer in and let him, because I did feel like on the first one we didn't do a good job of representing. And so my friend Byron got in and spoke, a 19-year veteran of law enforcement. And I just think, it's going to be polarizing. It's going to be difficult. People aren't going to agree. But if we can't have those conversations in the church,
Right.
How can we possibly expect the world to have those? So it's our chance to have this conversation.
Brian, talk to us about that, because it appears that every time, and I've done very little compared to some of the things where you folks have weighed in. I think about when I watch sort of the response to you. You got hammered, Matt.
It's a long day.
And your snippy responses kind of elongated that day.
Well, I don't usually do that, Ed. I was fired up, man.
You were, man. You were
zealous.
You were breaking open a can of Stomp that day.
I think I was on the receiving end of it, though.
Well, there was plenty to go around. Yeah. There's plenty to go around. But it does sort of illustrate that as soon as you have this conversation, particularly, we're even here, we have 3 African-American leaders, and you differ. But then you get an Anglo who has a different view, or a Latino, or an Asian, or better. How do we have this conversation without, people were, you got text this morning, so were I. Be careful what you say. Don't say this, don't say that. How do you have this conversation where people are afraid to talk about issues of race?
What's interesting, Dr. Corey Edwards, who I would recommend to everybody, she's a sociologist at The Ohio State University, strong believer. She wrote a wonderful book called The Elusive Dream. Her specialty is she really diagnoses multi-ethnic churches. And one of the heartbreaking things that she says that her research has borne out, and that pragmatically I've seen at Fellowship Memphis, is that minorities will always look to majority ethnicity for permission. And so if you take a worship environment, for example, there's just something in which African Americans, I've had it happen to me over my 11 years here at Fellowship Memphis. Oh, Pastor, I really would have, but they look around and they didn't get permission from their white brothers and sisters. There is a power that you have that silence does not give us the freedom as minorities to really feel as if we could express. One of the things I really appreciate about Matt Chandler is Matt, I remember one night I'm out to dinner with my wife trying to get quality time with her, and he texts me, hey man, is there some good jazz music I could listen to? And there's, I text you back Miles Davis. Or a book, The Warmth of Other Suns.
Favorite book of 2 years.
And recommend, and here's Matt reading that, and I'm going, this guy really trying to learn here. And the mileage that accrues with people who are minorities is huge from just simple things like that.
So talk to us about the BD. What do you want from majority culture? Okay, now again, we recognize that there are categories we could use on this, but I think most people would agree there's kind of a majority culture. It's predominantly Anglo. And at least for now, by 2042, it won't be any longer. And already in the schools in the United States, it's not. But there's still a prevailing culture, a predominant culture out there. You've gone to grand jury. We looked at the numbers. Overwhelmingly, whites are saying the grand jury got it right. African Americans the other direction. Do you want to persuade the culture that it's wrong in the grand jury? Do you want to persuade the culture to care about Black Lives Matter? What do you want as you're speaking to the people watching today?
I want us to work really hard to live up to our best ideals. I want us to work really hard to figure out and pursue justice, equality, love for neighbor. There are things I could push into deeper if I'm just thinking about Christians in that, but if I'm just thinking widely majority culture, I think what African Americans have always asked and insisted upon is that the kinds of ideals that seem to us providentially written by the hand of God into the framing documents of this country would be accorded without prejudice to all the citizens of this country. And that the systems and processes that are at work to ensure freedoms would be at work to ensure freedoms for all of its citizens. And so, yes, Black lives matter. But when we say that, we're not saying other lives don't.
Sure.
We believe all lives matter. In fact, it's African Americans who have fought for that in this country. When they cry out, "Ain't I a man?" Or now in today's equivalent say, "Black lives matter." It's African Americans who have had the best theological anthropology in this country, insisting that all people were made in the image of God and therefore equal before God and ought to be equal before each other. I would not ask the country anything other than it live up as best it can to its own ideals. Because I think the ideals, as far as I can tell, are unimpeachable.
Good man.
So one of the things, if you've been watching the BD on Twitter, is to go back to this idea of privilege and privilege trying to protect their perks and like the amount of Anglos that are offended by the hashtag Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
Are you trying to say white lives don't matter? Sure. I mean, the fact that that has to even be said is crazy. And that's perk, protection, don't understand, not even going to try to understand. I can't believe only Black Lives Matter, I guess, which that just shows the level of ignorance that you're dealing with across. And I'm not saying Anglos have cornered the market on ignorance. So, but I am saying that if you watch it, you can see just how deeply divided we are when hashtag Black Lives Matter, in the light of all that's just happened, is offensive, predominantly to Anglos.
Mm-hmm. But and I've known you, Matt, for years. We've known each other for a while. I don't think I've seen you as passionate and vocal on the issue until the last few months. What changed?
So a couple of things changed. Primarily, my friendships with African Americans has grown exponentially. On the next panel that'll come up, Pastor Eric Mason will be on the panel. I was at dinner in Vail, Colorado, so think a lot of white people. And the white is strong in Vail, Colorado. And,
not just the snow.
Not just the snow. That's right. So Eric and his wife Yvette were with Lauren and I eating dinner. And nice restaurant. Eric's a foodie. If he wants to get into that when he's up here, he can. But the brother likes good food. I respect him, support him in that. And as we were eating, this older lady just came by with this look of disgust and disdain. And I just remember it just made the rest of the night awkward. And I felt violated. Like I felt like I wanted, oh gosh, what's Job when he wanted to break the fangs of the oppressive, right? Like I felt offensive. And I'm not the one that got the look. I was just there. And then Leonce Crump has been pulled over on multiple occasions while another police officer makes his way up to the front. And I use this in a sermon on the Imago Day where his white wife, the officer comes and asks her, hey, whispers to her while Leonce is being entertained in the back, hey, are you here against your will? So if that happens to black people, then I don't get it. If it happens to my friends, people I know, people I love, people I walk with, people I pray for, people I'm in the trench with, then man, I start to feel like I want to fight. Amen. And so what's happened is this is a discipleship issue. It's that we're not walking with one another. We don't know one another because it's risky and it's difficult. And I get offended and people get offended. It's messy. It doesn't seem to be getting less messy, but more messy because I get accused for not pushing hard enough while my Anglos are saying you're pushing too hard. So I don't want to lose my Anglos, but at the same time, my African Americans are going, it's not black enough here. And I'm going, my goal's not to be black. My goal is for us to be the people of God. And so you find, and so see, I'm getting animated, right? Like, I want to wrestle somebody, right? Not you, brother, but somebody. Give me a small brother. Give me somebody small so I can use my reach. But that's what's happened to me. Like this issue. And then I started saying, help me understand.
Yeah.
Help me understand. So, man, I started getting books. I started reading. I started having dialogue. We started saying, we're going to intentionally hire qualified, godly, African-American, Latino, and Asian. And then all the difficulty that's been to find an African-American elder, that's been climbing Everest with no tools. But God's granted us that. But now all it's done is incited me to frustration because I've got one African-American central elder, and it looks like tokenism, despite the fact that he's PhD, brilliant, godly, ferocious man. But it still looks like it. So African-Americans, again, are just like, well, you just got the token black guy. I'm like, you freaking kidding me? It's been 8 years of praying and fasting to get that guy. And so that's a snapshot. I could keep going, but we don't have time.
Tony, I want to come back. I want to come back to you because one of the things he talked about was he went to systemic issues. Leonce, in the article he wrote right after your article in the It's Time to Listen series, if up to my recollection, said he's been pulled over at least once a year, every year since he was 19 years of age. And so people here, when Matt started talking, they resonated. They resonated with the injustice that was there. What do you want? Do you want to say, well, that's not real, or that's because there's a disproportionate percentage of African Americans who are involved in things they shouldn't be? How do you respond?
No, like I said in my article, those things happen.
Yeah.
And it happens because people are sinners.
Those things happen is a hard word to hear.
It happens because people are sinners.
Okay.
People are sinners. And all the answers that we've been hearing are the right answers. Right. They're the answers that are about the gospel and individuals. They're the answer that are about the gospel and people entering into one another's lives. Yes, those are the answers. But what I'm saying is, and this is a much more technical discussion, I want to be clear too. I know Matt. Matt and I are friends. We go way back. My statement about Gramscian Marxism and the concept of white privilege was not directed at Matt.
Sure.
It was directed at that concept, which did come from a Marxist professor. Gramscian Marxism, cultural Marxism, is the new white supremacy. Divide everybody into race, class, and gender. They're preferred minority groups. You gain power by claiming to represent preferred minority groups. So the race, this whole racial issue, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry when you can represent the oppressed group. And what that does is it keeps us divided. That's what's keeping us divided.
But I think to be fair, you also know that the idea of psychological wage goes back to W.E. Du Bois, that the idea of white privileges really doesn't come to the surface until '88 with Peggy McIntosh's article on the invisible knapsack. These are not Marxist issues. Marxists also believe in a graduated income tax. So do we say that that's a Marxist issue as well?
Yes, it is.
So the flat tax is Marxism,
it is.
Repealed.
But again, understand, cultural Marxism is different.
Agreed.
Gramsci's approach was different. Agreed. And this idea of dividing people into preferred minority classes is part of that system.
Which is not how most people use the term white privilege in the conversation.
And it keeps people divided, but it's rooted in that. And
I would say it's rooted in Du Bois.
That's the point that I'm trying to make. Yeah. And see, it used to be that we dealt with social Darwinism. White people said, I'm superior to you because I've evolved more than you. Now the same people are able to say I'm superior, but it's not because of evolution, it's because of my privilege. I'm still being patronized. I'm still being insulted.
So
I'm still being told I need help.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I'm still being told that I can't get there.
Matt, respond.
I come from a proud people who have gotten there in spite of. And there are people who are white, who are absolutely racist, who need to be challenged on their racism. There are people who are black who are absolutely racist, who need to be challenged on their racism. But we need to understand that what we're doing is that we're dealing with two different issues here. We're dealing with the issue of these interpersonal relationships and how the gospel breaks down walls and unites us. And we're also dealing with this issue of a culture that for a long time has been intentionally divided by individuals who profit from that division.
Fair enough.
And that there is a long-standing narrative that is not going to go away if it is not challenged.
Okay, so in challenging, I want to encourage people to, it would be helpful, Google cultural Marxism, Google white privilege, but I also think they should Google Peggy McIntosh the invisible knapsack. I think that's when I see Matt using the terminology.
Who also coined male privilege and American privilege in the
which
same...
all would be part of McIntosh's art.
All part
and
of
I'm
McIntosh's
not a full
article.
endorser of everything she wrote,
Yeah.
but that's when, or even Du Bois's psychological wage, where whites and blacks were paid differently. So this goes back a long way. So Matt, explain it one more time. Why the term, even as you hear voting,
I
who's
hear
saying,
voting.
yeah.
So, and I don't know that we disagree, but we might. So I'll talk, brother, and I don't need to encourage you. But the in the end, what I'm seeing is an inability or an unwillingness for my Anglo brothers and sisters to consider what it's like to be in the 13th percentile of American society. So I was just up in Philadelphia preaching for Pastor Mason, and we got there early, and we were heading to a reading terminal to eat some good food. And as I was walking there came this moment as I was heading to the terminal that my wife and I were the only white people you could see in a sea of humanity. We're the only Anglos. And I realized I've never felt this in my life. I've never felt, one, am I supposed to be here? I mean, I felt that. Have I stumbled into a place that I should not be? And then I felt, gosh, I hope they know that I like them. Because, you know, I mean, then I was like, dang, is that a racist thought? And then I'm having to go back up to the room and have this conversation with my wife about, I felt as though, and so then in my head, I'm going, gosh, man, my brothers feel this all the time. Or they might feel this all the time. Maybe they've gospeled themselves out of it. But like the people that I'm pastoring, predominantly, they have no idea of that. Oh man, am I supposed to be here? Am I allowed to be in here? Why are they staring at me? Are they angry that I'm here, or do they just recognize me? Like none of that. Anglos don't have to feel any of that unless they find themselves 40 years old, military brat, lived all over the U.S. First time in my life I looked up and went, dang. I am the only white dude for blocks. Yeah. So that I'm trying to wake them up to consider.
That's okay, we've got to move on. We've got to move on. Darren, you have been. I apologize that you didn't get a chance to weigh in as much as I would like, because I think you've done good work that has really provoked us all to love and good deeds. Amen. Talk to us what the future. What are you doing, and what would you encourage us to do? You're right there near Ferguson and with campuses. What are you planning to do in the future? What would you encourage us to do in the future?
The day after the verdict, we went down there, got to meet a close relative of Michael Brown. So we're involved with the family and trying to figure out how we can serve and help. We are encouraging these conversations. We've got a team of lawyers in our city who are coming into that area. A lot of the issues in poor neighborhoods is they don't have representation. They get taken advantage of left and right. They don't have good lawyers. That's an issue. We're going in, we're planning a church. We're taking our counseling center that we have, and we're going down there. We're taking our job creation nonprofit, and we're just going in, man. And this is our problem. Like we are taking responsibility for the brokenness in our city, and our churches. We cannot not do that. So it's not an option for us to lay back, to continue to pat ourselves on the back. We're doing all kinds of great stuff, but if we don't do this, if we don't go in there armed with the gospel, with a lot of humility, we fail. And so we're going in. I don't even know what, like, I named some of those things. Maybe we throw 5 against the wall and only 2 stick, but we're gonna put all of our arrows there and say we're coming in with the gospel.
Amen.
I appreciate you. I appreciate all of these gentlemen on the panel today. Would you join me in welcoming them, thanking them while we transition to welcome our next panel? Would you do that? We are, to remind those who may have joined us late, we're live from, Lorraine Motel, but I mean, it's the National Civil Rights Museum. The introductions, we jump right into the conversation because the lower thirds kind of list who's the participants, but I'm here with Brian Loritz. Brian, you are leading the Kainos movement, which is, there are three sponsors, if you will, here. One of them is Ministry Grid, which is Lifeway, which is providing the live streaming, and all these resources will be available at Ministry Grid afterwards. The other is the Kainos movement, and I want you to explain what that is in just a bit, but also the Gospel Coalition shared a passion for this. Many of their council members were here, and so they approached us Gosh, it was like late last week, and they wanted to be a part as well, so we're excited to have them be sponsors as well. Appreciate Don Carson and Tim Keller's article on that as well. But let's talk for just a minute.
Fellowship Memphis.
And Fellowship Memphis. I guess with the Kainos, I'm kind of connecting to Fellowship, but you're right. Fellowship Memphis as well, the church you serve here. What is the Kainos movement? Tell us a little bit about what you're doing.
Yeah, kainos is from the word, it's the Greek word for new, which is the idea of invention, something the world has never seen before. And what's happened, over the years is we've seen God just do amazing things, Ed, in growing a multi-ethnic church. We've had a lot of cups of coffee with young leaders who have said in their own way, we want to do what you're doing. Our passion, honestly, to dovetail on this conversation, is I think there's power. I mean, what if Darren Wilson and Michael Brown went to church together? I mean, you can just think about that for a moment. What if they went to church together? And they're in a community group together, and just the residual effect of that, stereotypes are broken down, and we're not hearing stories like this. So we want to see the multi-ethnic church become the new norm. Yeah. And one of the ways in which we do that is we equip through our national conference, which is coming up April 22nd and April 23rd, 2015, right here in the city of Memphis. And it's for leaders of nonprofits, churches, church planters, from all over the world are going to be there to get equipped in training, so we're excited about it.
And so they can get more information at where? I know it's on the website. What's the website?
Kainos, that's Kainos.is.
Okay.
Kainos.is.
Kainos.is, and they get more information there. And an important part of the conversation is to have these conversations.
Absolutely.
I know that seems strange. It's almost redundant. But these kind of conversations aren't happening a lot, weren't happening a lot. They seem to be picking up a little bit.
Absolutely. And I'm incredibly hopeful. I had someone ask me, one of our staff guys, if you could live any time in world history, when would it be? I said, as a black man, right now. It's as good as it gets. Yeah. And so I'm incredibly hopeful for the future.
Yeah. One of the things we talked about earlier in the research is we've come so far, and yet more people say, and actually much more strongly agreeing among African Americans, we've got so far to go. Absolutely. And I think the question is will these conversations include a robust gospel passion in the midst of them? Or they're going to happen around us. I mean, it's stunning to me that we see this every night on television, and infrequently do we see evangelical Christians having these conversations. So we're going to continue our conversation. We have a second panel that's joined us. I want to remind you, we've just jumped in because our time is short. I want to remind you that who they are is, of course, identified on the bottom of the screen for those of you who are watching. But we have pastors and writers and people who are passionate about some of these issues. And I want to start with this issue of racial reconciliation. I want to show you another graphic that I think addresses this, and I want to go to Derwin Gray afterwards. But one of the questions we asked of Protestant pastors in the survey was whether they agreed or disagreed with this statement, somewhat or strongly. Racial reconciliation is mandated by the gospel. Now and I recognize that phrase is loaded with what's the gospel, what's the implications of the gospel, what are the connections to the gospel. But what was fascinating to me was the fact that 90% of the respondents, we'll put it on your screen so you can see it on Views on Race and Racism in America. Among Protestant pastors, 90% agreed that racial reconciliation is mandated by the gospel. And so an overwhelming number, yet what we find is, in other research we've done, that most churches aren't necessarily evidence of a passion and a process leading to any engagement in racial reconciliation. I'll give you another one. 82% of all Americans agree that racial diversity is good for America. Derwin, I'm glad you're here for a couple of different reasons. One, you represent an extra measure of diversity on the panel because you're the only Arminian.
I'll roll with John Wesley any day.
Yeah, there you go.
That was good.
Thank you very much. I'm glad you chose to be here. The rest of us, I think most of the rest did not. But Derwin, for those who don't know Derwin, I really encourage you to get to know him. But Derwin, why do you think it matters that the church be involved in a multi-ethnic, multi-racial conversation in the first place?
Well, I think it matters first and foremost because at the heart of the gospel, the good news is that there's a new king who has a kingdom, and he has brought people into that kingdom by his grace. And that king made a covenant with Abraham that through you all the nations are going to be blessed. And the Apostle Paul, a first century Second Temple Jew, was heaven bent on colonizing earth with a heavenly people in a incredibly fractured world. Incredibly fractured world by social economic, by ethnicity, by gender. There is a reason why Paul said there's neither Jew nor Greek, free nor slave, male nor female, because we are one in Christ. And so I would say that the church itself, us, we have allowed our racialized culture to influence us more than the Christ. So I understand whether if it's white privilege or whether if it's fallenness, but what I want to hear is a blood-soaked solution that Christ is our peace, that he broke down dividing walls. That's what I want to get to. That because I believe that there's a resurrected king who is the solution. But we have to understand there's a new people. That before Jesus roamed this earth, there was Jew and Gentile. After his resurrection, there was a whole new species that was defined by his blood, and she is called the church. My blackness does not define me. My Christness does define me. Now, that doesn't mean I don't stop being black. I'm always going to be black.
Right.
But the beauty of it is when we bring all of our differences together under the lordship of Christ, that's what the world wants to see. And from that, we become agents and ambassadors of reconciliation. One of the things we do at Transformation Church, we have partnerships with schools as far as mentoring. I was with the sheriff of Indian Land, South Carolina yesterday. In order for there to be systemic change, we have to engage. And I love what my friend Brian said, that without proximity, there's no empathy. And so what I see is black and white Christians primarily live in two different worlds because we have these things called black churches and white churches. And these, well, you're supposed to say white churches. That's politically incorrect, I guess. But we do have those things versus saying my preferences are secondary to this good news that there's a king. So I am overly optimistic and idealistic that the church, not a building, but people who are blood-soaked, that the Prince of Peace is ruling and reigning. So it's a discipleship issue for us. That's what I believe.
Okay, good. Charlie, talk to me a little bit. You wrote on your blog after the Eric Garner decision, quoting, "I've recently become aware that my views on racism, and specifically the Eric Garner case, are a bit radical. Not only are they radical, these views could actually cause friends," which you put quotes around, "to distance themselves from me. We do that too often in Christian circles. I have been very tempted to withdraw." Why would a Christian brother or sister distance himself from you on these issues? You've written a book on the subject of on these issues. You've spoken winsomely and graciously on these issues. I guess I don't think of you as radical, but others have. Talk me about that.
Well, this issue, I think, and we're having this discussion because it revealed great division.
Yes.
Yeah.
And great division among Christians. And so when I came out and began to speak pretty strongly that I stood with Black Lives, I didn't do the hashtag thing.
Sure.
But
Why didn't you do the hashtag?
I just think I want to go to my neighbor and share the gospel with my neighbor. Twitter is it's a great means for discussion, but I'm kind of with Darren. I want to go and have a relationship with someone.
Fair enough.
So Twitter to me is good and useful, but it's not where I'm going to spend all of my time and
fair enough.
energy.
Fair enough.
That's why I didn't do the hashtag. But in terms of in terms of speaking bluntly about what I believed, I did do that.
Yeah.
And as I started to get emails and responses, it was very clear that it was not a popular view. And so for me, I was tempted to withdraw out of fear, out of weariness. Am I going to be able to share what I really believe, knowing that there are going to be people who are against me. But the Lord was faithful, because he is, and he's good. And if God is for me, who can be against me? So I persevered, and that's why I'm here today, because I just believe wholeheartedly that that the gospel breaks down barriers, and that we can have this conversation. We need to have this conversation, and so I want to have it.
Good.
Can
Quickly,
I
go ahead.
real quick? I'm getting in trouble. I'm saying, isn't it kind of hypocritical for us as Christians to say racism and stuff is wrong when nearly 90% of our churches are homogeneous?
Yeah.
Like, isn't that hypocritical, though? Now, I get it, but I just don't know if we really, really believe in the blood, the cross that breaks hostility. I just, that's where I want to see this conversation epically move fast. Because I felt like my blog, literally, of course, I could totally be wrong. It won't be the first time that I've been wrong. But I felt like mine was the only one that was pointing towards the church.
Right.
And I felt like it wasn't controversial enough because I focused on the blood and the church.
Yeah. Yeah, you did part of the series we did, right? It's time to listen. And you're right. I mean, I would say Ryan and Leonce had way more readers because you pointed to the church. So is there, John, let me go to you, John. You wrote, of course, Bloodlines. And in there, you are pretty forthright. You say that I don't pastor a multicultural church, or to the level of the community you indicated in one chapter. Minneapolis is not exactly a bastion of multicultural in any way. But you're passionate and care about this issue, sometimes for personal reasons, but you went much beyond personal reasons. Why are you speaking up and into issues of racial justice, multi-ethnic ministry? Why speak into that conversation? Why does it matter to you?
Well, let me not start at the most important place, but at the place you just referred to. Minneapolis is more diverse than you think it is.
Sure.
And it depends on where you live. Phillips neighborhood is probably one of the most diverse neighborhoods in the country, which is where we live and where the church is on the edge. So I felt that measure of inauthenticity my whole ministry, because we didn't achieve what you feel so obviously is what's wrong. And so that's one of the reasons that I live in a very colorful neighborhood with a couple hundred languages.
Sure.
So to get up and walk down the street to the bakery is to be indicted for the kind of church that we had in not being as diverse as it was. And when Matt said 8 years of prayer and fasting for an elder, that's not a joke.
Yeah.
And it might be in itself implicitly racist to say you went about it the wrong way to think it's that hard, but reality. So, number one.
Do you need some water? We can get you
No,
some
no,
water.
I'm okay. I sound like this all the time. I'll holler if I do. Thank you for asking. The main reason, though, I went to a Moody conference for pastors years ago, and Moody has done yeoman's work on this issue to try to make that pastors' conference multi-ethnic. And so I preached there, and my point was from Revelation 5:9, you were slain, and by your blood you ransomed people for God from every tribe and tongue and people and nation. And my point was simply, this is not a social issue, it's a blood issue. That was my little phrase, blood issue. And that's carried the day for me. I don't like the social gospel. I know the history of the problems. I know how the gospel can get watered down. I want to start from the Bible, end with the Bible. And the Bible is, I think, if I had one word to say to pastors for making progress on this issue, I'd say preempt the next news event. Preempt it with Bible. So that when you stand up to respond to something that happened on the weekend, they don't say, there he goes again. He's not again. He's been doing it all along with Bible because it's so deeply rooted all over the Bible. And the answer to your first question is yes, the gospel mandates reconciliation in terms of When two people are brought to Jesus, they're brought to each other, period. That is the most important relationship on the planet right there. It's more important than any of their blood relations, hence bloodlines. So for those two reasons, where I live and what I walk among and the Bible I read makes me not be able to sleep at night if there's not something being said at the church about this.
Is part of the mission, you said the gospel mandates reconciliation, racial reconciliation. Is part of the mission of the church racial reconciliation and issues of racial justice, do you think?
Here's the context. I'd start with the Bible, and I would say, when a person is born again, he has a new nature. And old things have passed away. All things have become new. Right at the heart of that newness is a radical love for Jesus Christ, a radical new readiness to sacrifice for human beings. And Jesus says, love your neighbors yourself and love your enemies. If we could all be born again and go straight to heaven, that's all I'd do is evangelize. I think that's all I'd do. I'd just evangelize. If everybody I could lead to Jesus just died at that moment, bang, they're dead. I say, whoa, that was quick. Straight, perfect sanctification in 2 seconds.
Amen. I'm for heroin.
Here's the reality, though. You save somebody through Christ, by the Holy Spirit, at 25, they've probably got 50 more years on the planet. Their sanctification is slow. What does it involve? They got to do something. They got to go to work. They got to relate to neighbors. They've got to live their lives in relationship with people. And if you ask them, okay, does the gospel, which caused them to be new, have anything to do with all of those points of life? Everything. That's everything. And so, yes, it mandates that Christians speak truth into these situations that we're dealing with right now, so that I think the gospel, in terms of transformed lives for policemen and in terms of burden for social dynamics, will incline Christians to help police figure out ways to disarm criminals without killing them. It just gets that practical. The gospel would incline a person to think, aren't there ways in the 21st century when we can land on the moon that you can disarm a person without killing him? Surely there's a way. I think the gospel gets that specific.
Albert, I want to ask you specifically to address, respond to John, but also want you to address what's the role of the church, and how do you lead your church to be engaged in some of these issues in our culture today?
So I think, Dr. Piper, you're absolutely right. The problem with that
Hold on one second. Are we good on the sound with him? Because I'm not hearing him. Okay, we're good. Okay, go ahead.
At this, black people should be extra loud at this panel, man. Come on, what are y'all doing? Come on, let's go. My volume
I'm
should
just
be
saying.
They're assuming you're going to be loud.
Right. They assume I'm going to be loud.
That's right.
I still can't hear myself. No, okay.
I know the feeling.
I think we are here at the Lorraine Motel where Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated, not because we got it right, but because we got it wrong.
My.
And here we are 50 years later, and that's why I push a little deeper on the answer, because it has to start with the Bible and end with the Bible. But I believe those pastors were saying, I was preaching the Bible then, we're preaching the Bible now in diverse neighborhoods, and they're still not experiencing diversity. So although the Bible is the answer, we've got to contextualize that more, unless our children and grandchildren are coming back here for another panel 50 years later because they got it wrong again. We have to build churches where we push disciples toward one another. There's a vertical push, but it has to be a horizontal push, because I can go to church every day, read my Bible every day, and never sit down and talk to a white person. Yeah. Black culture, I've got to know white culture by default. I can't get a GED without having understanding white culture, but a white person can get a PhD and never know black culture. So we've got to push and make an intentional step to understand and to step in one another's story, or else you can live your whole life, walk with Jesus your whole life, and never know a black person, never have black dinner at somebody's house, never experience the joy of,
black dinner.
Sweet tea. Come on, Ed. You look like you done had a couple of black dinners. You know a black dinner. You know a black dinner. You had a couple of black dinners.
I've had a couple.
So at our church and with our staff, we make it intentional to say we've got to push each other towards one another. As soon as this thing hits, we pull the staff in the room and we say, all right. And we give each other permission to tell the truth about what they feel. I start off by first, of course I'm a racist. Of course I am. I'm a recovering racist by God's grace, but of course I'm a racist. How can I say that? Because Ed's a racist, Brian's a racist, John, bless your heart, brother, you're a racist. All of us, we're all recovering racists. We grew up certain ways, studying certain things, developing certain ideologies, and they all get challenged. So when the gospel comes in there, it's got to redeem some stuff. You put me in Asian culture, I'm lost as the day is long. I don't know what to do. I don't know if I said that. I don't know if Karate Kid is offensive or not. I don't know if that's bad or not. So I got Asian brothers and sisters that are saying, no, Albert, that was the dumbest thing you ever said in your life. Don't say that again. I was like, okay, all right. I'm just fine. And vice versa. So we have a staff and a culture. This past week, my wife was at our mom's group. And they're talking about mom's issues, and Ferguson comes up, and my wife, because our church is diverse, probably 50% white, 50% everything you can imagine, because it's in California, and we got stuff in California I just never hear of in Mississippi, like races and stuff. So anyway, they're in there, and she starts talking about Ferguson, and she starts telling her story as a black woman from Mississippi, and she started crying, tears started flowing, and white moms gathered around her in a way that they had never had before, never in their life with anyone else. One of the white moms knocked on our door the next day. She's in the office, and she said, I just want to thank you, because this is a church where we can have the conversation. She said, Albert, I was afraid to even bring it up. I didn't know if I could bring it up. I didn't know if I could say anything, but hearing your wife speak about it, this is what got me. She said, I went home, and the way I read Facebook comments changed. She said how I saw the comments, she was just from a conversation with my wife, she was now offended and more critical and had more understanding just from a 5 to 10 minute conversation. What happens if the church pushes us together like that on a regular basis?
Amen. Eric, I want to come to you, Mace. You tweeted December 4th, you tweeted, the gospel of Jesus itself isn't a social gospel, but it does have sociological implications. And you hashtag minor prophets and Titus 3. So talk to some about that, because I think part of the challenge in many in evangelicalism is if we engage in some issues of, to use the term, social justice, right? That we might lose the gospel.
Yeah.
Particularly, that's perhaps more of an Anglo conversation, but I hear it a lot. I hear people saying, this is not a gospel issue. I've heard people rebuke for saying this is a gospel issue, you're confusing it. But then I hear, not all, but many African-American sisters and brothers saying, no, this really, the gospel has, and people use different language, they say implications or it flows out of the gospel. So what do you mean, and how does it work out that the gospel of Jesus isn't a social gospel, but it has sociological implications?
Yeah, I think Titus 3 is clear. It tells us in Titus 3, Paul exhorts Titus about his missiology in the churches on the Isle of Crete. And he demands that they serve their city. And then he takes the gospel of regeneration through the philanthropy of God, through seeing our brokenness and engaging us, as an implication for how we engage our cities. And so that's huge for me. But I think in this conversation, one of the things we've forgotten about is spiritual warfare.
Yeah.
We've literally forgot that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood. We think we wrestle against black and white. And I think we've totally forgotten that. And I think we need to get back to the gospel reality that we don't wrestle against flesh and blood, number one. Number two, I think the main issue is we got to go through gospel cycles with this. And what I mean by gospel cycle, the same way we got justified is the same cycle we go through in our sanctification. And what I mean by that is repentance and confession and repentance. There is an issue here. If we don't admit there's an issue here, there's no way to deal with the issue. And so believing the gospel to transform that particular thing and then taking us to the conclusion of engaging on a practical level. And so when you look at the idea of just this whole idea of a social gospel, I mean, I've read Rauschenbusch, I've read Gustavo Gutierrez, I've read James Cones, and all of those guys are in 3 different cultures, but promoting the social gospel. And I think what has happened is because we've seen people who have emphasized social justice, neighborhood ministry, and all different types of physical care in neighborhoods, who many of them forgotten discipleship of the soul, where people stayed faithful to the fundamentals of the faith, not only stayed faithful to the fundamentals of the faith, but saw the external things as an outworking of the challenges of Christ transforming the inside of a person. And that's close to my heart because I minister and live in an inner city neighborhood where I have to do both. I don't get to choose and call transformation of men who are dealing with whether fatherlessness, single mom issues, 90% abortion rate, and then college student issues and the different ethnic issues that we're dealing with in our neighborhood right now between white college students, African American historic neighbors, and not look at how in the world does the gospel engage this. And so I think that we have to get to the point where we have to step out of, all of us, out of our ivory towers and begin to ask ourselves the question. We want to biblically root our understanding of transformation of all things in the scriptures, like Pastor John said, and then talking about what Tate said, I think is powerful. And so Titus 2 for me is a powerful passage because it was like a discovery for me, because sometimes in my theological journey, I saw people putting on blast, engaging in social ministry. But my issue was, social ministry is not the issue if you keep it rooted in who Christ is and the gospel of regeneration, which in the kingdom, whether you believe in already or not yet or whatever, I believe in already or not yet. I believe a kingdom is coming and I believe a kingdom is here. And so in that reality, it should have practical implications on the quality of life of each person. Not a prosperity gospel, but a basic equality of quality of life that we should be making available to each and every person. Even in Israel, when in the privilege of Israel at points when God was blessing it had great privilege. But the Levirate law demanded that they not graze the edge of their land. Why did they not graze the edge of their land? So that the sojourner would come through and see these nice people, because they didn't have anything to eat or anywhere to stay. And so they would do social ministry and bless them. And when that would happen, it would bring them near to the God of Israel. And when they got near to the God of Israel, they got close enough to experience the love of Lord Yahweh and then begin to hear about the truth of believing in this ruler. What if we take that transcendent Old Testament principle, implant it in the same gospel principle that we see throughout the book of Acts, and see the glory of Christ shed light on all of those different things in a powerful and crazy way?
To what Pastor Tate was saying, is when we look at discipleship, Jesus said, go make disciples of all ethnos, and he was saying that to Jewish folks. Then he restates it in Acts 1:8, Judea, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the outermost parts. And we celebrate the Acts 2 church, but the Acts 2 church was disobedient. They stayed in Jerusalem. It wasn't until Acts 1 that God allowed persecution to come through Saul and many others that Philip finally went to. What did I say? 8:1 is what I meant. Thank you. That's when the church finally went to a cross-cultural means and the church at Antioch. So I would say that when have we ever had a discussion in discipleship about cross-cultural relationships? That's one of the greatest things we've seen at Transformation Church, is that we grow in the midst of our cross-cultural relationships, and we've developed a theology around it based on the Great Commission that we're to go to the other, and going to the other is how transformation takes place, and also conversations. I had a snotty-nosed white dude run down the aisle after a service one time, snot dangling everywhere. And I thought, what would Jesus do? Well, it was too late. He grabbed me and started crying and said, I can't believe I'm in church. I'm so glad somebody invited me to church. My pastor's black, and I don't even like black people. Eventually, he became a friend. Eventually, I performed his wedding. And his wife asked me to walk her down the aisle because her father was not involved in her life. So you have a former racist who's now experiencing the grace of God. But that can't happen as long as we continue to stay in our silos. And I'm with Brian and everybody up here, that if we as God's people are not intentional with a Pauline gospel that was heaven bent on not only just vertical reconciliation, but the overflow to horizontal reconciliation. And those are some difficult conversations. They're awkward. You know, one time I was preaching and the backdrop was dark, and a white lady at our church goes, "I'm sure glad your teeth are white because that's the only way we could see you." And she was just smiling, and the black people were like, but we're able to have those conversations, and our black folks have said some crazy stuff too, and Latinos and Asians. But what I'm saying is that if we, as God's people, do not understand that when grace was given to us by faith, in Ephesians 2:11, Paul says, therefore, that the grace of God was given to us so that a heavenly colony could be on earth. And I reiterate that it is hypocritical for us to point to the world and go, racism. And we don't even walk to the people across the street because they're different. That's where this has to begin and end, is at him. That it's a mockery of him. We're asking unregenerate people to do what we've been called and commissioned to do. And we need a generation of people to stand up and be counted, and in our fear, go in his grace. If we're really preaching about grace, because the grace of Ephesians 2:8-9 leads to Christ himself is our peace. He tore down the dividing wall. We don't believe in the cross and the blood as much as we think that we do, because it ain't just about sending us to heaven when we die. It is about building heaven on earth while we live.
Trillia, you wrote United, Captured by God's Vision for Diversity, which...
What do you think about that, Ed?
I like it. What do I think about what you said? That was awesome. But I'm going to go on Trillia now, if that's okay. So Trillia, reflect a little bit on what Derwin said, but also, here's the question I would have. Okay, so Derwin says, walk across the street. Now, I live on a street that is predominantly, I think actually a family moved, so it's now predominantly Anglo. It was predominantly non-Anglo a few months ago. But most of the places in the United States are actually not as diverse as Los Angeles is today.
Sure.
Most of the geography, not necessarily the population, but most of the geography. So first, reflect a little bit on what he said. What's your theme there you're bringing forth in the book, and how do we do that when Memphis is a city divided by race?
Right.
I mean, there's not a secret there. And we're in Memphis. How do we do that when we live in different parts of cities and communities?
Sure. Well, I'll start by agreeing with what he said.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad that this conversation has turned to relationships.
Yeah, that's good.
Because I believe that is what we're family. And I think if we understand our adoption as children of God and that we are a family, and if we turn that conversation to that, I think it makes a difference. And that is, I think, where he's going, is that we're family. And so for us to deny that, or for us to not step into the shoes of someone who is different than us, is really denying our family. So I agree wholeheartedly. I think this is about building relationships. Russell Moore wrote in his book, Adopted for Life, there's a quote that I love, and it says something like, if a white businessman, CEO, were being discipled by a middle class, whatever you want to call it, Latino, would we be surprised? Should we be surprised? Is that something that should be odd? Knowing that the Latino is more mature in the things of Christ. That's what we should see in the church. That is that dividing wall that is broken down and that we should see. And so in United, that's what I wrote about, my relationship with a white female and an Asian female, and how the Lord, he didn't just give me friends, but he gave me sisters, because we are sisters in Christ, because that's what the scriptures tell us. We are heirs with Christ. And so I think that if we can start to see each other as brothers and sisters, and not just be words, but it be really that we really are captured by what I believe is God's vision for diversity and what's in the gospel. If we're really truly captured by this, then we can go and pursue. Okay, something else you had mentioned. Yes, you are right. Every community in the United States isn't diverse. But I think what we need to ask ourselves is, are we getting to the heart? And so I don't think what we want to do is condemn people who live in homogenous neighborhoods or who aren't able or who live in Appalachia. Okay, it's just white.
Sure.
So we don't want we don't want to condemn, but what we want to ask, if someone like me came into your neighborhood, what would your response be? Okay. We want to get to the heart. So, and when I was at the University of Tennessee, and I remember I was 18, 19, and a young gal ran up to me and started talking, and she was really excited to talk to me, and I thought, oh, this is neat. She wants to be my friend. But it was because I was the first black person that she had ever seen or spoken with.
Wow.
And I am young, so this isn't,
right.
I'm not old, so this isn't in the 60s is what I'm saying. This was in the 90s. Yeah. And I was the first black person. But had she responded and seen me in fear, suspicion, because of stereotypes that she had thought, what if she had come up to me and started talking a certain way because she felt like that's what she needed to do to relate to me? That would have been that would have been a heart issue, but she wanted to get to know me. Yeah. And I think if we can have churches where we are coming to each other's for black dinner and going to, it's going to be a new thing, and I love it.
I didn't know that was a thing. I feel left out.
Black milk. So yeah, if we can start entering into one another's lives and really getting to know one another, it will change this conversation. And that's why I was so affected by the Garner case and his death, because he's a person. And someone on my blog wrote a comment, well, he deserved it, basically. And I said, he's a person. Aren't we supposed to mourn? This is the death of a person. If someone committed suicide, would we tell that family member, no, you can't mourn? So we can talk for days and months, and we can talk about juries and whatnot, but what we need to get to is the heart, and these are people, and this is about relationships. So the church this is about a people, not just a building. We hear that, it's a cliche, but you know what I'm saying. And so we want to get to the heart and talk about relationships and people, and I think it changes this conversation.
I want to add in, but I want to summarize where I've heard a lot of today. I've heard a lot of when people are changed by the gospel, it changes their relationship and outlook with other people. The church becomes a place where discipling is involved that actually leads to genuine reconciliation, racial reconciliation. By the way, interesting, if you Google racial reconciliation, that's actually a Christian thing by and large. So that's a phrase that we use that often flows out of that. So we're talking about lives changed by the gospel leads to a changed outlook, a different view, a different approach. We're talking about churches that reflect that. Now, just those two things, we've got a long way to go. We would agree with that, but I don't think that's the totality of the conversation. But why do you think that matters so much?
I want to. This is important that I express.
Yeah, please.
Because we live in a day and age in which it's very popular for well-meaning. I'll say it this way: if we're not careful, I see well-intentioned whites get into relationships with minorities under the guise of help, and it's very patriarchal.
Yeah.
You need relationships with minorities who don't need you.
Right.
Like, I can go out to dinner with you and I can pay. I got good credit. I don't need your help. So I want to be, help is good.
Right, but peers we're talking about.
But we
here.
need peer relationships, or you end up with this Messiah complex and actually strengthening the very thing you're trying to dismantle.
The great white hope then becomes, okay.
And to add
please.
to that,
please, Eric.
B is, man, we'll know. I'm going to say something just off the map.
Come on.
I think that you'll know when black and white racial reconciliation is beginning to take root, when a large number of whites can submit to black leadership.
Yes.
Right. Yes. Because if we talk about multi-ethnic churches, especially in America.
And now, hold on, and not feel the need to be in authority with them to check their leadership.
Sure. Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. I think when you talk about multi-ethnic churches where the pastors are black
Yes, sir.
or minorities and the
sir.
congregations are white or diverse, then the numbers get really, really, really small.
That's right.
So that whole dynamic of being able to submit to black leadership, because we love having black dinners, But I think that's a big dynamic, and we'll know it. The problem is we allow Fox News and CNN to give our people the talking points, and our disciples sound more like disciples of Fox and CNN than they do of Jesus Christ. And we've got to contextualize our pulpits and our platforms in the gospel so that way when they hear that craziness on these news bites, and then when they hear, like Vody, I never heard of him, I never met him before. Hearing him unpack what he's saying, I kind of almost agree with him. But when Fox calls you and puts you on for 5 minutes, then what they've done is they've just used him to assassinate other black people in their experience, because it sounds like in a soundbite, or he's discrediting my experience or what I mean or what I say. Hearing him unpack what he's saying today, man, I get where he's coming from. When you allow Fox to call you and give you 30 seconds, they are calling a black man for a reason, and that's to prop up their statement and their perspective. And MSNBC, CNN, they do the same thing. We've got to get our talking points out of the media and get them centered in the gospel like Dr. Piper was talking about, and we've got to push that message.
Yeah, let me just
say
one more thing, and Tabiti mentioned it in his blog. White evangelicals will attack the issue of abortion voraciously, systemically. I want to see that same passion to issues of racial injustice.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I want to see that same passion. It's disingenuous to attack abortion systemically, and then all of a sudden, we go mute when it comes to issues of racial injustice.
Yeah, you wrote in your blog, over the years, I've been challenged by my white brothers and sisters to just get over this. Their refusal to attempt to see things from my ethnically different perspective is a subtle, stinging form of racism itself. Now, I want you to address that. I do want to say, Vody's not here to respond. I mean, he's over there, he's off the camera to respond. And I would say, having seen him articulate this in other places and other spaces, that he has unpacked this more. So I think that's probably helpful. I disagree with him, but I think it's important to know that he's unpacked
it was good. It was just good to hear more than the soundbite. In media, they do the sound bites. I love Ed. I know you're the moderator, but I would love to hear Dr. Piper respond to Brian's statement.
Yeah, please, go ahead. As you were saying here, though, before we go over to John, my question is this.
No, I had said, Ed, I loved it, but you.
Yeah,
okay.
It's all good.
All right. Okay.
So my question is this.
It's white privilege, Ed.
It is white privilege. It's what's called here moderator privilege. And in this case, it's his show.
Got it.
So when you hear, I mean, are you saying that people who don't respond and aren't aware at the same level issue that, I mean, you say specifically, it's a subtle, stinging form of racism. So, I mean, you're calling out something pretty strongly.
Yeah.
So why?
Well, my wife is here with her fine self. She has a story. She has a narrative, and it's inappropriate for me to get into it. We all have a narrative. And when she, especially in those early days of marriage, as we're still on the journey of two becoming one, as she would share some of the not so pretty parts of her narrative, for me to just dismiss her is in a lot of ways not only disrespectful of her and her narrative, it's dehumanizing.
Illustration, Doc. Perfect illustration.
And so all I'm saying is we have a narrative. And for you to just dismiss it and in a way be condescending and criticize me as jumping to conclusions or being naive, it dehumanizes me. And it is a subtle, stinging form of racism.
John, why don't you respond?
To what?
To what he just said.
Well, I have no disagreement with what he just said.
You see, it's a subtle, stinging form?
I mean, the illustration of the marriage kind of twists the knife that if somebody tells you their story and you make light of it, you're demeaning them. It's just the way it is in human relationships. So it's a very helpful analogy, I think. If I could say anything, it's only that probably there is a fear, perhaps, in some whites of being emotionally manipulated. In other words, being coerced, being forced to say the right emotional thing at this moment, especially if it's just all over the media, the Twitter sphere. Where's the compassion? Where's this? And you're sitting home with a broken heart for this and this and this and this, and just 126 people just been killed in India, and people been killed in Pennsylvania, and people being killed in or was it just another Israeli, Palestinian is killed yesterday, and every one of them is supposed to just break your heart. Yeah. And so there comes somebody else pounding you. Where's your broken heart? It does cause you to reel and say, okay, emotionally, what does this mean? What does this mean to live in a world like ours? Somebody asked me a question on APJ the other day. Don't you have to be ignorant or callous just to survive in this world? And I said, yes, you have to be ignorant of some things. Only God can handle the knowledge of all the pain in the world and not be destroyed by it. And so I feel like, how do you measure that? How do you manage that? How do I theoretically, I'm saying yes. Authentically, if you and 10 other people in any given day tell me I should feel this towards their pain, I say, yes, weep with those who weep. But in reality, I might start to feel like, I don't think they can tell me to do that. I just don't think they can manipulate me like that. So that might be a caution.
But it feels like that in this time, to quote, I think, Brian, what somebody you said, I mean, this is not one of many things. Maybe more for Anglos, and there's a higher level of urgency in the African-American context. But this is not one of many things. This is what is dominating the news. And your call has been, let's not have evangelicals sit out this conversation like they did in the past.
Amen.
Eric, you were gonna weigh in.
No, I just think that these trials were really more, I mean, not more, but I think they were trials for the church. And what I mean by that is I think our immaturity in the area of the gospel and race and our immaturity in it was deeply exposed.
Yeah.
And I think we're not here at the Lorraine Motel for nothing. We're here because there have been black men killed by police for years. That's why there's an NWA. That's why there's a, public enemy back 20 years ago, 25 years ago. But I think this moment is something about this moment that I think the church, I felt it. Because I do feel like some pulpits that I grew up listening to were too social justice oriented, to the point where conservative evangelicalism backed up from having a prophetic voice that was centered. I'm not talking about the gift of prophecy. For those of y'all scared, I'm about to,
Go ahead on
but I'm just saying the prophetic voice that says what Amos says, let justice roll down like waters. I'm not even talking about the case. I'm just talking about, is there a larger issue that we need to be peering into that may be a blind spot to me? And it seems like Paul is speaking all over, or whoever wrote Hebrews, saying, I need to teach y'all over again, because y'all supposed to be teaching others, but you can't even teach. So I got to start you back off at the fundamentals. And it's almost like in our new members class, covenant communities, partnership classes, there has to be an entire class.
Yeah.
That is the season opener, the season opening pitch for the church beginning to unveil and engage on race. I know whole African American church leaders that are just they have an apathy towards it because they don't really feel like the larger world of evangelicalism is going to enter empathetically and practically into the conversation in a way that's going to help affect the lines. I mean, and so I think the whole idea, I think what my brother's saying and my sister's saying about multi-ethnicity is important, but I don't want us to get to the point where we think the gospel makes us multi-ethnic colorblind.
No.
And I'm not saying y'all saying that, but the issue is it's almost like if we make our theology colorblind, then what happens is we discount the stories of people and homogenize, if that's a word, I just made it up.
Doc. Make it up.
Homogenealize, cut out. I mean, our experiences, then what we cut out is what makes the meta-narrative a part of our micro-narrative. And so I just think it's important.
Lots of people want to jump in, and so I'm going to go to Derwin and Trilly. Go ahead, Derwin, you first.
Yep.
Well, and back to what Dr. Mason is saying is we have to engage these narratives in a real space, in a real place, in real community.
Absolutely.
And I didn't grow up in the church, so I don't know what political correctness is. And I just, here it is, y'all. And so I didn't grow up in a church. Probably 60% to 55% of our church is white. in South Carolina, black, Latino, and sure, there's messed up folks in your church and my church as well.
Absolutely.
But this sanctification and that the gospel bears down on it. And I think at the root, we've believed for the most part a gospel that just points at the individual versus Paul saying the gospel points to a greater story, that God is creating a new temple on earth, that as the book of Psalms says, all the nations would come. And that's the crescendo of Ephesians 2. I've never heard that preached. That this grace creates this new temple where worship and sacrifice. And so all I'm saying is, let's get our narratives together. Somebody's got to be courageous. And if we're Christians, don't we lead with forgiveness? Don't we lead with the cross? Don't we lead with, yes, we can be taken advantage of? Now, our stories are different. I've read yours. I didn't grow up in a church, grew up on welfare. For a while, I was the only man in my family over the age of 20 to not be in jail, not be on drugs. For me, football was not a game. It was to get out of where I was. Making it to the NFL has shielded me from a lot of the discussions as I've read y'all's story from Bible college and stuff. It has shielded me, but there's still times where I'll be at a conference and I'm like the only non-white guy. Or I'll get done speaking and I'll hear, "You're so theologically sound." Like, well, what'd you expect? Like, I graduated magna cum laude. I'm working on my doctorate. Like, what did you, you know? And so I feel what you're saying. I just think that the blood calls us, right, to just engage and lead in such a way that we may get taken advantage of. But I would rather get taken advantage of leading into this issue because I think it's at the heart of the gospel.
Take the risk now. We only have a few minutes left, and so I'm sorry to cut you off, but Sherry, I want to make sure you have a chance to weigh in.
Well, I just wanted to say two things. We want to be careful not to assume that because someone's not on social media that they're not speaking to this issue.
Sure.
So if, for example, my husband, who is white, if he's not on social media, he doesn't care about social media, but is he talking to our kids about this? Yes. And so we want to, but I also think that that's why it's important to build relationships, because if we've got people who are leading classes, we have people who are around a dinner table who are actually having these conversations, well, that's where real change is going to happen. We can sit on this panel and we can tell you, love the gospel, preach the gospel, go find your neighbor. But if you're not going to do it, then it falls on, it's nothing. So I think that what we want is this faith in action, and for real lives to be changed and for this to really affect our country, we've got to do it, and it's mostly private. It's not going to be public. People aren't going to necessarily see it. They're not going to see me go to my neighbor who's Indian and sit in her living room and listen to her and engage with her. They're not going to see that. Yeah. So we need to do it in our private homes where no one's going to see it, as well as the public. That's
good. We only have a couple minutes left, but I'm going to ask the same question to John and Albert. I know all the polls point that we're in a time of racial polarization. Specifically, even most recent polls, one we did and others, that we've made less racial progress, or we've kind of lost ground. Even in the most recent years, almost all polls saying, even with President Obama being the first African American president. But it seems to me, and I could be naive, but this kind of conversation, and I know there are others being launched. I haven't seen this much talk about this maybe since Promise Keepers. So, John, I wonder, as an Anglo pastor in a predominantly, retired now, working as Iron God, but in a predominantly Anglo church, are you encouraged about the tone and tenor of racial reconciliation conversations now? And then, Albert, I want you to answer the same question as well, and why?
It's mixed.
Yeah.
You know, there's discouraging things to see, and there's encouraging things to see. This is encouraging. I told the brother I was having lunch with today that the number of young, black, theologically rich, socially aware men feels fresh to me, feels new to me. Didn't see it a generation ago. That feels really hopeful. I think the last thing I'd want to say is just speak to pastors, if I could, just 1 minute.
Please.
Brian, I wish there were more pastors passionate and courageous about abortion. You make it sound like it's a lot, and perhaps comparatively it is, but there are cowards in the pulpit. Cowards in the pulpit who are looking at the pocketbooks, looking at their membership lists, who won't touch that issue with the 10-foot pole. Abortion, they won't touch. And how much less racism. So my first plea for pastors is be bold. They were all filled with the Holy Spirit, and they spoke the word of God with boldness. Pastors, be bold. That's the first thing. And second thing I would say is preempt the issues on abortion, on racism, and others biblically. Go there first. Go there first. And capture the vocabulary. Otherwise, you'll inherit all Fox News vocabulary, all the ideological vocabulary if you haven't provided your people with a biblical vocabulary to talk about the issues. And the third and last thing I would say is don't think of this as dealing with a crisis for the moment, and it'll be gone and over. Think of it as marriage. Marriage, nobody who's been married 30, 40, 50 years has a blow up and says, a golden moment for fixing it. Nobody thinks that way. You work it through and hope you make a few incremental processes, and you go on and take whatever joys you can get. And that's the way it's going to be till Jesus comes. So I don't want pastors to walk away from this. Yeah. I want them to stay at the table and just keep hammering away. If they get clobbered for doing it wrong, just come back and do better.
Albert, I want to ask you to kind of address, the LA Times recently had a story that increased number of women speaking up on these issues in race and justice, women and men, pastors and church leaders of all different denominations have been having these conversations. Again, are you hopeful? Are you discouraged? Are we making progress as evangelicals? Talk to me.
So yeah, I'm overall, I'm hopeful, and overall, I'm very discouraged.
Okay.
I want to compliment Dr. Piper's comments. So while it's fresh to see, from your perspective, these rich theological pastors, I've been drenched in them all my life. So we have great, theologically sound black preachers. So I don't want to breathe this idea that all of a sudden Eric Mace, Derwin, Brian Loritz, and Albert Tate are some new phenomenons. We are not. We have been trained and poured into by legends of the faith that would never get invited to Gospel Coalition, that would never get invited to Passion or Catalyst or any of these other predominantly large white gatherings, but that does not mean that they do not exist. I am so thankful that you have gotten proximity now and you can see what we've known for years, that the black church and theological experience is rich. There are people, and unfortunately they got large TV budgets, that write another narrative. But that is not the core story. So I'm thankful that we're starting to see other black leaders that are robust theologically in these settings. Secondly, I feel like it's great not to be a coward in the pulpit, but don't be a coward in the neighborhood. Don't have courage in your pulpit and then go and live in your predominantly white neighborhood and pastor a predominantly white church, or vice versa, and not take the courage that it takes to cross across the bridge. It's important to preach it. It's another thing to give a theological vision to your people where you contextually live it out. It's as practical as looking at the last month. Who have you had dinner with? Who have you eaten with? Do they all look, live, and vote like you? If they do, you have missed one of the most beautiful elements of the gospel. So while you have courage in the pulpit, have courage in the community and the neighborhood, and pursue racial reconciliation.
Which is what Dr. Piper has done in living in the neighborhood, which I appreciate. Let me say one more thing on the other side.
Please.
I think what God's teaching me in my years of multi-ethnic ministry, sometimes we minorities can wait for our white brothers and sisters to say something they shouldn't and then just go upside their head. We can lack grace.
Yeah, it's got to be love.
And the ball doesn't get moved down the field while we're waiting on majority culture to mess up. So there's got to be grace on our side of the table. And when they say something they shouldn't say, to deal with it, let them confess and repent and move on.
And when we say stuff, Ed, I think we gotta have, the centerpiece has got to be grace. It's grace that allows us to sit with Dr. Piper, with Matt Chandler, and hearing them say the courage and the boldness to step up and say, I want to talk about race in this Twitter world where your soundbite can be used against you to beat you down. I mean, just the courage to have that. So if we could drench this whole conversation and the dialogue that we want to have in the living rooms and in the dining tables, they have to be drenched in grace, or else they'll end up in people being upset and walking away, and that's not the gospel either.
Brian, of course, we've gone over time, but that's okay. I want, gosh, what was it, like almost, it was like a week ago, you texted me, say, hey, can you chat? And then we said, let's moderate this thing. And then Lifeway came on, Ministry Grid with the Partner with Fellowship Mentor, and then Gospel Coalition a few days after to do this. And I was anxious and nervous, and we both got 1,000 texts this morning. Hope you guys survive this.
Praying for you, right.
Because it's fraught with danger, but the opportunity in the moment is more important.
Absolutely.
So what would you say to, we know, literally thousands of people are watching. Yeah. What would you say to the pastors, to the church leaders, to people who are watching about what they can take away from this conversation? And I'll wrap us up with a few final words.
Let's live all of Ephesians chapter 2, all of it. Historically conservative evangelicals have stopped at the end of verse 10. We love, for by grace you have been saved through faith. Wonderful, but that's vertical reconciliation, which is the most important. But verses 11 to 22 cannot be disconnected from verses 1 through 10. If you do that, you've got the liberal church, and there's no power there. So we've got to live all of Ephesians chapter 2 in all of her glory, and we've got to be out on the front lines, not just offering sympathy, but offering true hope. And the hope of the gospel, yes, gets to the heart, forms personal relationships, but the prophet also spoke to issues of systemic injustice and said, we got to talk about this because all lives matter. That's the hope.
We, as they wouldn't necessarily know, but we know, we're all going out to, the panel is going out afterwards to dinner. I'm hoping it's black dinner. And so I can know, I feel like I've been excluded to know what that is. And we're going to continue this conversation. And our hope is that you too might continue this conversation, that we know that people are watching in groups all around the world. Our hope is you might continue this conversation. We're going to continue to challenge each other and even disagree, but we're going to do so from a perspective of brothers and sisters in Christ, learning from one another. We think this is a key moment. So when Brian texted, I said, yeah, I'll come, I'll moderate. Why? Because I think this is a key moment for us to speak. I want to again remind you that the Kainos movement is hosting this event, Fellowship Memphis sponsored, but Kainos, and you can get more information about their movement at kainos.is. It's to exist to empower people, organizations, churches towards genuine diversity. Their national conference, April 22nd and 23rd. And I want to commend it to you. Brian, I'm thankful that you hosted this conversation. I know thousands of people around the world are thankful as well. Thank our sponsors, Nolan, Lens Rentals, Ministry Grid, Fellowship Memphis, and the Gospel Coalition.
And let's also thank the National Civil Rights Museum.
For sure. So important. We want to invite you to come and to visit here at the Lorraine Motel. This is actually preserved. The front of it, you've seen it on history books. It's preserved very much like it was on April 4th, 1968. And throughout the museum, there are exhibits that really, I think, speak to our heart and remind us of important issues of the gospel and of justice and the challenge where we find ourselves today. Thank you for joining us online. Thank you for joining us in our studio. Would you join me in thanking our panel as well?